Captain Elena Reyes stood on the observation deck of Meridian Station and looked out at the stars. She was 23 years old, and she had never once seen the ship that made her famous, before she was even born. Everyone on the station knew her name. Everyone knew her face. Not because of anything she had done, but because of who her father was. Commander Daniel Reyes had been the chief engineer of the USS Earth. 20 years ago, he had kissed his pregnant wife goodbye and boarded the greatest ship humanity had ever built. 6 months later, Elena was born. And 6 months after that, the USS Earth vanished into a strange region of space called the Hollow Expanse, chasing a signal that no one could explain. It never came back. Not in 1 year. Not in 5. Not in 10. By the time Elena turned 15, most people had stopped hoping. By the time she turned 20, the history books called it a tragedy, not a mystery. The greatest warship humanity ever built, gone, along with 50,000 souls aboard it, including her father. Elena had grown up without him. She had grown up in a galaxy that no longer feared or respected humanity the way it once had. She had grown up watching her people lose ground, planet by planet, to species that once would not have dared to challenge Earth. Her mother, Julia Reyes, had raised her mostly alone on a small colony world called Haven, 3 jumps from Earth itself. Julia had refused to remarry, refused even to remove her wedding ring, holding on to a hope that grew thinner every year but never quite disappeared. She kept a shelf in their small home filled with photographs of Daniel, holograms of the two of them together before he shipped out, and a single flight jacket that still, she swore, smelled faintly of him if you buried your face in it just right. Elena grew up hearing the stories other children only read in books. She heard about the day the USS Earth was launched, the pride that had swept across every human world, the sense that humanity had finally built something worthy of the stars. She heard about the war against the Karn Dominion that came before her birth, a war Earth had won through sheer engineering brilliance, and the courage of crews who refused to back down. And she heard, over and over, about the day the ship vanished, told so many times by her mother that Elena sometimes felt she remembered it herself, though she had not even been born when it happened. By the time she was old enough to understand what her father's disappearance truly meant, she had also grown old enough to see the slow decline happening all around her. Haven Colony, once protected by regular patrols from Terran warships, saw those patrols grow thinner and thinner as the years passed. Merchant fleets from the Vey Combine began appearing more frequently, offering trade deals that always seemed to benefit the Combine more than the colonists. When Elena was 12, a Karn Dominion delegation arrived at Haven uninvited, offering protective services that colony leaders felt too afraid to refuse. She remembered the day clearly. She had stood at the edge of the town square, watching Dominion soldiers walk through streets that had once belonged entirely to her people, and she had felt something harden inside her chest that never quite softened again. That was the day she decided she would join the Terran Defense Academy, the day she decided that if no one else would fight to bring back what humanity had lost, she would try. She turned away from the window and walked toward the station's command center. Her boots echoed on the metal floor. Meridian Station was old, built decades ago as a shared outpost between several species, a place where trade happened and treaties were signed. Today, it did not feel like a place of peace. Today, it felt like a place waiting for bad news. "Captain Reyes," said Ensign Marcus Webb as she entered the command center. He was young, barely out of training, and he looked nervous. "Ambassador Osei wants to speak with you. He says it's urgent." "Put him through," Elena said. The main screen flickered to life, showing the tired face of Ambassador Michael Osei. He was the highest-ranking human diplomat left in the Galactic Concord, the governing body that ruled over trade and law between the many species of the galaxy. He looked older than his 50 years. The weight of representing a weakened humanity had aged him faster than time alone ever could. "Elena," he said. His voice was tight. "The Karn Dominion has moved another fleet into the Corvus system. That's the 3rd human colony they've threatened this month." Elena felt her jaw tighten. Corvus was a farming colony, home to almost 200,000 people. It had no real defenses. It had never needed them, not when Earth's fleets used to patrol those borders. Now it had nothing but a handful of aging patrol ships and the hope that the Karn Dominion would leave it alone. "What do the Concord elders say?" Elena asked. Osei's mouth became a thin line. They say it is an internal matter between the Dominion and the Terran Assembly. They will not intervene. Of course they won't, Elena said quietly. We're not worth the trouble anymore. It had not always been this way. Before the USS Earth disappeared, humanity held real power in the galaxy. Earth's fleets were feared. Earth's engineers built ships that other species tried to copy and failed. Earth had fought and won a brutal war against the Karn Dominion itself, 25 years ago, a war that ended with a fragile peace and grudging respect. But peace, built on fear, needs something to keep the fear alive. And when the greatest ship in that fleet vanished, taking with it thousands of the best officers, engineers, and soldiers humanity had, the fear began to fade. Slowly, other species tested the borders. Slowly, they found that humanity could not push back the way it once did. Colonies were taken under protection agreements that were really just quiet invasions. Trade routes that once belonged to Earth were claimed by others. The United Terran Assembly, humanity's governing body, had been reduced to fighting a long, slow, losing battle to hold on to what remained. Elena had trained her whole life to be part of the answer to that decline. She had graduated top of her class at the Terran Defense Academy. She had turned down offers to work at Assembly headquarters on Earth itself, choosing instead to serve on the border, where the pressure was greatest. She believed, the way her mother had raised her to believe, that humanity was not finished, that somewhere, somehow, things could still turn around. But standing here, watching another colony get swallowed up while the galaxy's rulers looked away, it was hard to hold on to that belief. Elena thought of Haven, of the Dominion soldiers who still patrolled her childhood streets, of her mother growing older in a home that had never stopped waiting for a husband who might never return. She had joined the academy hoping to be part of a turning point for her people. 6 years later, standing in the command center of a border station watching another colony fall, she wondered if that turning point would ever actually come. There's something else, Osei said. His voice changed, becoming quieter, almost hesitant. Sensor arrays near the edge of the hollow expanse picked up a gravity disturbance 6 hours ago. Unlike anything on record, the Concord is calling it a natural anomaly. But I don't believe that, Elena. Not with the timing. Elena felt something cold move through her chest. The hollow expanse. The same region of space where the USS Earth had vanished 20 years ago, chasing a signal no one ever explained. You think it's them, she said. I don't know what to think, Osei admitted. But I think you should come to Concord Central. If something is happening, I want you there when we find out what it is. 6 hours later, Elena stood in the observation gallery of Concord Central, the massive space station that served as the seat of galactic government. It was easily 10 times the size of Meridian Station, built by a dozen species working together centuries ago, before humanity had even discovered how to build starships. Delegates from more than 30 worlds moved through its halls, speaking a dozen languages, some of them not made for human throats to pronounce. Ambassador Osei met her at the private viewing deck reserved for the Terran delegation. He looked even more tired in person than he had on the screen. Thank you for coming so quickly, he said. You said something was happening at the Expanse, Elena said. What do we actually know? Osei gestured to a nearby terminal, and a hologram bloomed to life above it, showing a chart of gravitational readings. The lines spiked wildly around a point at the edge of the hollow expanse, a region of space so unstable and strange that no ship had dared enter it since the USS Earth vanished there 2 decades ago. 6 hours ago, sensor buoys near the edge of the expanse recorded a massive gravitational event, Osei explained. Far bigger than anything natural. Then, 30 minutes ago, we received this. He tapped the console, and the hologram shifted to show a burst of encrypted data, streaming across the display in strange, broken patterns. It's a transmission, Osei said. Old format Terran military encryption. Codes that haven't been used in 20 years. Whoever sent this either has access to ancient Terran assembly codebooks, or it's really them, Elena finished. Before Osei could answer, an alarm rang out across the station. Every delegate in the hall turned toward the massive viewing windows that looked out into open space. Elena's heart pounded as she moved closer, pressing her hand against the cool glass. At first, there was nothing but stars. Then, space itself seemed to tear open. A ring of blue-white light expanded outward, silent and terrible, like a wound opening in the fabric of reality. Every ship near the anomaly scattered, alarms blaring across a dozen communication channels at once. And then they came through. The first shape to emerge from the light was massive beyond anything Elena had ever seen, larger even than Concord Central itself. Its hull was dark, almost black, absorbing the starlight around it rather than reflecting it. Along its sides ran faint lines of pale blue energy, pulsing like a heartbeat. Elena recognized the shape immediately, even though the ship looked changed, rebuilt, upgraded beyond anything she had studied in her history classes. The USS Earth. Behind it, more ships began to pour through the tear in space. Dozens of them, then hundreds. They were unlike any Terran ship Elena had ever seen, sleek and dark, built from some material that seemed to drink in light rather than shine with it. They moved with a strange, silent grace, gathering into formation around the USS Earth, like a flock of great black birds around their leader. Across the observation deck, delegates from a dozen species began shouting at once, some in fear, some in confusion, all of them staring out at a fleet none of them could explain. "Report!" someone shouted from the command floor below. "What in the stars is that?" Elena could not speak. Her throat had gone tight, her eyes fixed on the massive dark shape drifting toward them, silent and enormous, trailing that strange fleet of black ships behind it, like a shadow given form. Ambassador Osei's hand found her shoulder, gripping tight. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "Elena, look at the hull markings." She looked. Even from this distance, even after 20 years, she could still make out the faint lettering along the ship's side, half hidden beneath new layers of dark armor plating. US, Earth. It had come home. Chaos broke out across Concord Central within minutes. Delegates shouted over each other, demanding explanations no one could give. Security forces from a dozen worlds scrambled to battle stations, uncertain whether the fleet approaching them was friend or enemy. Communication channels overloaded with panicked messages, each species trying to reach their home governments before anyone else could react. Elena barely noticed any of it. Her eyes stayed locked on the massive shape drifting closer, the ship her father had died aboard, or so everyone had believed for 20 long years. "They're transmitting something," a Concord technician called out from the command floor below. "Audio only. Terran military channel." "Put it through," Osei ordered, his voice steadier than Elena expected. Static crackled through the hall's speakers, and then a voice emerged, calm and clear, a voice that carried the weight of command earned through hard years. "This is Fleet Admiral Sarah Cole, of the United Terran Assembly Navy, commanding the USS Earth and the Fourth Fleet. We are returning home after 20 years lost beyond the hollow expanse. We come in peace to those who remain our friends." A pause followed, heavy and deliberate. "And we come with a warning to those who believed humanity would not return." The hall fell silent. Elena felt her heart hammering against her ribs. Fourth Fleet. 20 years ago, the USS Earth had left with a handful of escort ships, barely a dozen. Now hundreds of dark ships hung in formation around it, weapons silent but clearly, unmistakably present. "They built a fleet," Osei murmured, disbelief in his voice. 20 years, trapped somewhere beyond known space, and they built an entire fleet. Elena's mind raced. Her father. If Admiral Cole was alive, if the ship had survived, then maybe, just maybe. "Ambassador," a new voice interrupted, sharp and demanding. Elena turned to see a tall, armored figure striding onto the viewing deck, flanked by two guards. She recognized the ridged gray skin and sharp yellow eyes immediately. A Karn Dominion officer, wearing the insignia of a fleet commander. "Commander Threx," Osei said carefully. "This is not the time." "That ship," Threx snarled, jabbing a clawed finger toward the viewport, "belongs to a species the Dominion no longer considers a threat. 20 years, Ambassador. 20 years we have watched your people grow weak, and now this fleet appears, and you expect the galaxy to simply accept it?" "It is not for the Dominion to accept or reject," Osei replied, his voice hardening. "The hollow expanse is not Dominion territory, and neither is Concord space. The USS Earth has every right to return home." Threx's eyes narrowed. his gaze sweeping across the massive dark fleet visible through the viewport. For just a moment, Elena saw something flicker behind his confidence. Uncertainty, perhaps even fear. "We shall see what the Dominion makes of this," Threx said finally, turning sharply and storming from the deck, his guards close behind. Elena barely registered his departure. Her attention was fixed entirely on the comm channel, still open, still carrying Admiral Cole's voice as she issued calm, practiced orders to her fleet, coordinating their approach with the ease of someone who had commanded far worse dangers than a nervous galactic council. "Ambassador," Elena said quietly, "I need to get aboard that ship." Osei turned to look at her, understanding immediately what she meant, what she needed. "Elena, we don't even know what they've been through, what they've become. 20 years is a long time." "He's my father," Elena said, her voice breaking slightly despite her effort to keep it steady. "If there's even a chance he's alive over there, I have to know." Osei studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll arrange it." "But Elena," he hesitated, choosing his words carefully, "whatever you find over there, whoever they've become after 20 years in that place, be ready. They may not be the same people who left." Elena nodded, though the warning barely registered against the storm of hope and fear rising in her chest. Outside the viewport, the USS Earth continued its slow, silent approach, trailing its shadow fleet of dark ships behind it, like a promise the galaxy was not yet ready to understand. Whatever had happened out there, in the 20 years since the ship vanished into the hollow expanse, one thing was clear to everyone watching. Humanity had not been destroyed. It had not faded quietly away as so many had hoped or assumed. It had come back, and it had come back changed. Across the Concord, on 100 different worlds, the news was already spreading. Governments scrambled to respond. Military commanders reviewed decades-old files on Terran fleet capabilities, wondering how much had changed. Ordinary citizens on human colonies, people who had grown up believing their homeworld's greatest ship was nothing but a tragic memory, stared up at their night skies and wondered if the stories were true. On Haven Colony, Elena's mother Julia stood in her small kitchen, watching the news broadcast, with a cup of tea growing cold in her hands, her eyes fixed on the grainy footage of the massive dark ship emerging from the tear in space. She did not speak for a long time. Then, quietly, she set down the cup, walked to the shelf where Daniel's flight jacket still hung, and pressed her hand against it, as though she could somehow reach across the distance and touch him again, after 20 long years of silence. On a dozen other human worlds, similar scenes played out. Families who had given up mourning fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters found themselves suddenly uncertain whether to hope again. Colony leaders who had grown used to bending under the weight of Dominion and Combine influence found themselves wondering, for the first time in years, whether they might soon have a choice in the matter again. Not everyone welcomed the news. In the boardrooms of the Vey Combine, executives who had grown wealthy trading along routes once controlled by Terran shipping lines began quietly reviewing contracts, wondering how much of their profit might soon be threatened. In the war rooms of the Karn Dominion, military commanders pulled up old files on the USS Earth's original specifications, trying and failing to reconcile what they remembered with the massive, transformed fleet that had just appeared at the edge of Concord space. The USS Earth had returned, and nothing in the galaxy would ever be quite the same again. Elena stood at the viewport long after Osei left to begin arranging transport, watching the great dark shape draw closer, her heart caught somewhere between hope and fear. 20 years of grief, 20 years of decline, 20 years of watching her people lose their place among the stars. Maybe, she thought, that was finally about to change. 20 years earlier, Commander Daniel Reyes stood on the bridge of the USS Earth as it chased a signal into the unknown. He was 31 years old then, newly promoted to chief engineer, proud beyond words to serve aboard humanity's flagship. His wife was pregnant with their first child back home, and he had promised her he would be back before the baby was born. He believed it when he said it. The signal had come from deep within the hollow expanse, a region of space so unstable that no ship had ever mapped more than its outer edge. Strange gravity readings, flickers of energy that made no sense according to any known physics, and static-filled bursts of something that looked almost like a distress call. Admiral Sarah Cole, then a rising officer barely 40 years old, had convinced the Terran assembly that it was worth the risk. If it was a distress signal, lives might be at stake. If it was something else, something new, the knowledge could be priceless. The USS Earth entered the expanse with a small support fleet of 11 ships. Within hours, every ship's instruments began failing. Navigation systems returned readings that contradicted each other. The stars outside the viewports seemed to shift and blur in ways that made the crew sick just looking at them. Then, without warning, space itself seemed to fold. Daniel remembered the moment clearly, even 20 years later. A wave of blue-white light swallowed the entire fleet, and when it faded, nothing outside the ship looked familiar anymore. No recognizable stars, no signal home. Every communication attempt returned nothing but silence. They were lost. For the first few months, panic gripped the crew. Admiral Cole worked tirelessly to keep order, rationing supplies, organizing search efforts, trying every method the ship's scientists could think of to find a way home. But the expanse, wherever it truly was, seemed to swallow every attempt. The strange gravity wells that filled the region made travel unpredictable and dangerous. 3 of the 11 support ships were lost within the first year alone, torn apart by forces no one fully understood. It was during a desperate search for a stable path home that they found the wreck. That was what the crew came to call it, a massive structure floating at the heart of the expanse, larger than anything humanity had ever built, clearly artificial, clearly ancient. Its surface was covered in strange markings, half of it torn apart by some catastrophic event long before humans arrived. Admiral Cole ordered a careful approach, sending scout teams to investigate. What they found changed everything. The wreck had belonged to a civilization long extinct, a species the surviving records called the Architects, though no one could be certain that was truly their name. They had built the structure as some kind of shipyard, a place where enormous vessels were constructed, using technology far beyond anything humanity understood. Something had destroyed them, some catastrophe that had ripped through the region centuries or millennia ago, leaving behind only wreckage, dormant machinery, and fragments of knowledge locked away in systems that took Terran engineers years to even begin to understand. The first scout team to enter the wreck's interior returned with reports that seemed almost impossible. Corridors large enough to fit 3 Terran warships side by side. Machinery that still hummed faintly with power despite centuries or millennia of neglect. Murals carved into the walls, showing images of a tall, slender species standing before massive constructions. Their expressions, if the carvings could be trusted, somewhere between pride and sorrow. Whoever the architects had been, they had clearly known this shipyard was important, perhaps the last great project of a civilization that sensed its own ending approaching. Lieutenant Commander Priya Nair, the fleet's xenoarchaeologist, spent the better part of a year studying those murals before she offered her theory to Admiral Cole. The architects, she believed, had built the wreck not merely as a shipyard, but as a fortress, a final defense against whatever had ultimately destroyed them. The murals told a story in pieces, of a darkness that came from beyond the stars they knew, consuming worlds one by one, until only this last stronghold remained. Even that, in the end, had not been enough. If they couldn't survive it, Nair told the assembled officers during one tense briefing, with technology this far beyond our own, what makes us think we can? Admiral Cole had no answer for her that day. But she gave the order to continue studying the wreck regardless, because the alternative, waiting helplessly in the dark for the Hollow to finish what it had started centuries ago, was no answer at all. Daniel Reyes threw himself into studying that wreckage. It was, in a strange way, exactly the kind of challenge he had always dreamed of as an engineer. Ancient technology, impossibly advanced, waiting to be understood. He spent months, then years, working alongside the ship's small team of scientists and engineers, slowly unlocking the secrets the architects had left behind. They learned that the material used to build the wreck's remaining structures, and the massive dormant ships still docked within it, was unlike anything found on Terran worlds. A strange dark alloy that absorbed energy, rather than reflecting it, capable of bending sensor readings around itself, making ships built from it nearly invisible to conventional detection. The crew began calling it dark metal, and the ships they eventually learned to build from salvaged and newly forged supplies of it became known, fittingly, as dark ships. But knowledge came at a price. The expanse was not empty. something lived there, something that had likely been responsible for destroying the architects in the first place. The crew called them the Hollow. No one ever saw them clearly, not truly. They moved through the expanse like living shadows, vast creatures of energy and dark matter that fed on the strange gravitational currents that filled the region. For the first 2 years, the Hollow left the human fleet mostly alone, perhaps not recognizing them as a threat, or perhaps simply not yet hungry. But as the crew's activity at the wreck increased, as their engines and scanners lit up more and more of the dead structure, the Hollow began to take notice. The first attack came without warning. One of the remaining support ships, the TAS Kestrel, simply went dark mid-patrol. When rescue teams reached its last known position, they found nothing but drifting wreckage and a hull torn open, as if by claws the size of buildings. 40 crew members were lost in a matter of minutes. Daniel had known several of the Kestrel's crew personally, including a young systems technician named Owen Farrow, who had shared quarters with him during the first months of the mission, and had talked constantly about a daughter back home he could not wait to meet in person for the first time. The memorial service held aboard the USS Earth that week was the first of what would become, over the following 2 decades, a grimly familiar ritual. Admiral Cole insisted on attending every single one personally, no matter how many there eventually came to be, standing at attention as the names of the lost were read aloud into the vast quiet of the ship's memorial hall. It was after the Kestrel's destruction that Cole made the decision to stop searching blindly for a way home, and instead focus the fleet's efforts on understanding exactly what they were dealing with. She authorized Dr. Singh's team to study the Hollow directly, using long-range sensors and, eventually, small automated probes, designed to gather data without risking further crew lives. What they learned only deepened the fear that had settled over the fleet. The Hollow were not simple predators. They seemed to communicate with one another across vast distances through pulses of dark energy that Terran instruments could barely detect, let alone decode. They appeared to grow stronger, not weaker, the longer the human fleet remained active within the expanse, as though their presence itself were somehow feeding whatever hunger drove the creatures. Admiral Cole made the decision that would define the next 18 years of their exile. If they could not escape the expanse, and if the Hollow would not leave them in peace, then they would have to become strong enough to survive it. She ordered a full mobilization of the fleet's resources toward 2 goals: understanding the architect's technology well enough to use it, and building a defense capable of standing against creatures that had annihilated an entire ancient civilization. Daniel Reyes became one of the key figures in that effort. Alongside a brilliant young scientist named Dr. Amara Singh, he led the team that reverse-engineered the first working dark metal hull plating. It took 11 months of failure after failure before they produced a piece of armor that could withstand a Hollow attack without shattering. The day they tested it successfully, the entire engineering deck erupted into cheers that Daniel would remember for the rest of his life. From there, progress came faster, though never fast enough for the losses the fleet continued to suffer. Over the following years, the crew of the USS Earth, reinforced by whatever they could salvage and build, slowly transformed themselves. They built the first true dark ship, a small, fast vessel called the Vanguard, capable of cloaking itself from hollow senses long enough to strike and retreat. They lost it, and its entire crew, during its 3rd mission, but the data it gathered before its destruction proved invaluable. The Vanguard's final transmission, recovered months later from a damaged recording buoy, became required listening for every new engineer who joined the fleet's growing dark ship program. Its captain, a soft-spoken officer named Nadia Volkov, had kept her voice remarkably calm, even as her ship came apart around her, calling out precise sensor readings on the Hollow's attack patterns until the very last second, ensuring her death would teach the fleet something useful, even if it could not save her own life. Daniel Reyes listened to that recording more times than he could count over the following years, and he made sure every hull plate his team produced afterward carried a small, nearly invisible marking in her honor, etched into the dark metal, where only those who knew to look for it would ever find it. The lessons paid for in blood accumulated slowly into real strength. By the 3rd year, the fleet had developed reliable methods for detecting hollow movement before an attack could begin. By the 5th year, dark metal hull plating had become standard across every surviving ship, cutting losses dramatically. By the 7th year, the fleet had grown confident enough to establish a permanent, defensible position within the wreck itself, using the ancient structure's own defensive systems, painstakingly repaired and adapted for Terran use, to help hold back Hollow incursions. By the 10th year of their exile, the fleet had grown from 8 surviving ships to over 30, each one built partly from Terran engineering and partly from architect technology, none of them fully understood, even after a decade of study. They had also grown as people. Children born during those years, including Daniel's own daughter back home whom he had never met, were now old enough that a new generation of crew members had been born and raised entirely within the expanse, knowing no other home. Admiral Cole never stopped searching for a way back. She never gave up hope, even as year after year passed with no success. It was Dr. Singh, working alongside Daniel and a team of dedicated researchers, who finally cracked the secret in the 15th year of their exile. Buried deep within the wreck's dormant systems was something the crew came to call the Gate Core, a device the architects had apparently used to travel vast distances instantly, tearing openings in space itself. It had been damaged in whatever catastrophe destroyed its makers, but it was not beyond repair. It took another 5 years to fully understand and rebuild the Gate Core. 5 more years of fighting off Hollow attacks that grew more frequent and more desperate as the creatures seemed to sense what the humans were building. 5 more years of losses, of funerals held in the ship's massive memorial hall, of a crew that had aged and hardened and grown into something the young officers who first entered the expanse could barely recognize. The battles did not stop simply because the fleet grew stronger. If anything, the Hollow seemed to grow more determined as the years passed, launching larger and more coordinated attacks against the wreck's defenses. The 11th year brought what the crew came to call the Long Siege, nearly 4 months of near-constant assault, during which the fleet lost more ships and lives than in any other period of the exile. Daniel remembered standing in engineering during the worst of it, running battle-damage repairs in near-total darkness, because power had to be conserved for the shields, listening to the muffled sounds of hollow creatures scraping against the wreck's outer hull, searching for any weakness they could exploit. It was during the Long Siege that Admiral Cole made perhaps her most difficult decision of the entire exile. Rather than continuing to simply defend the wreck, she ordered a coordinated counterattack, sending the fleet's best dark ships directly into the heart of Hollow territory, striking at what Dr. Singh's research suggested might be a central nesting structure, the source of the coordinated attacks plaguing the fleet. The mission was successful, destroying the structure and scattering the Hollow forces in the region, but it cost the fleet nearly a fifth of its remaining ships. The victory parade that followed was one of the quietest celebrations the crew ever held, subdued by grief even as it marked a genuine turning point in their fortunes. After the Long Siege, Hollow activity in the immediate vicinity of the wreck decreased significantly, giving the fleet the breathing room it desperately needed to focus fully on repairing the Gate Core. Daniel Reyes was 51 years old when the Gate Core finally activated successfully, tearing open a stable path back toward known space. He remembered standing beside Admiral Cole, now silver-haired and weathered by 2 decades of impossible command, as she gave the order to prepare the fleet for departure. 20 years, she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. 20 years, and we're finally going home. But going home was not as simple as it sounded. In the months leading up to their departure, Cole had ordered extensive study of whatever communications they could intercept, as the Gate Core's activation began to create ripples that reached, faintly, into normal space. What they learned troubled her deeply. Terran colonies annexed by hostile powers, trade routes lost, a galaxy that had written humanity off as a fading, weakened species, easy prey for those willing to take what remained. Admiral Cole called a final meeting of her senior staff before the fleet's departure. Daniel attended, standing alongside Dr. Singh and a dozen other officers who had become, over 20 years of shared hardship, something closer to family than colleagues. "We are not the same fleet that entered this place 2 decades ago," Cole told them. "We have learned to survive against creatures that destroyed an entire civilization. We have built ships and weapons beyond anything the galaxy has seen. When we return, some will see that as a threat. Others will see it as an opportunity to finally push humanity aside for good, believing us too changed, too strange, to still belong among the stars we once called home." She paused, looking around the room at the faces of officers who had fought and bled and lost friends and family members to survive this long exile. "We will not return as conquerors, but we will not return as victims either." We fought for 20 years to survive. We will not allow what remains of humanity's place among the stars to be taken from us without a fight." Daniel thought of his daughter then, a child he had never met, now 20 years old, and living in a galaxy he barely recognized from the reports Cole had shared. He thought of his wife, who he did not even know was still alive. 20 years was a long time. People changed. People moved on. He did not know what, if anything, still waited for him back home. But he knew one thing clearly, standing in that briefing room alongside the Admiral and his fellow survivors. Whatever waited for them on the other side of the gate, they would not go quietly, not after everything they had survived, not after everything they had built. The gate core activated 3 days later, tearing open a massive rift in space at the very edge of the hollow expanse. Admiral Cole gave the order, and the fleet, now numbering over 200 ships strong, began its slow, deliberate advance toward the light. Daniel Reyes stood at his post in engineering, watching the readouts as the USS Earth crossed through the gate for the final time, leaving behind 20 years of struggle, loss, and hard-won survival. Ahead of them lay a galaxy that had long since given up on them, a galaxy that had moved on, believing humanity's greatest ship, and everyone aboard it, gone forever. They were about to learn how wrong that belief truly was. Behind him, the officers on the bridge exchanged tense, quiet words, as sensors began registering unfamiliar signals, faint remnants of communication chatter, bleeding through from the other side of the rift. 20 years of silence was about to end. Admiral Cole's voice rang out clearly across the ship's internal comm system, steady despite the weight of 2 decades pressing down on every word. "All hands, prepare for translation. We are going home." The gate's light swallowed the fleet whole, and for a brief, disorienting moment, there was nothing but blue-white brilliance surrounding every ship. Then, just as suddenly, it was gone, replaced by the familiar black of normal space, filled with unfamiliar stars, and the distant, glittering shape of Concord Central floating in the distance. They had made it. After 20 years, the USS Earth and its fleet of dark ships had finally come home. The question now was what kind of welcome awaited them. Elena's transport shuttle approached the USS Earth slowly, dwarfed by the massive dark hull looming ahead. Even from a distance, she could see the scars along its surface, patches of new dark armor grafted alongside sections that still bore the original Terran gray paint from 20 years ago. The ship looked like something rebuilt from the inside out, familiar and alien at the same time. "Approaching Docking Bay 3, the shuttle pilot announced. "Command has cleared us for entry." Elena pressed her hand against the viewport, watching as the massive bay doors slid open ahead of them, swallowing the small shuttle into the enormous ship. She had spent every moment of the 6-hour journey from Concord Central, trying to prepare herself for what she might find. Her father, if he was even still alive, would be 71 years old now. She had no memory of him at all, only stories, old photographs, and a handful of recorded messages her mother had kept for her over the years. The shuttle touched down with a gentle bump, and the doors hissed open. Elena stepped out into the docking bay, and the first thing she noticed was how quiet it was. Rows of dark ships sat docked along the bay's edges, their black hulls seeming to drink in the overhead lighting. Crew members in modified Terran uniforms moved between them, some pausing to glance at the new arrival before returning to their work. A woman approached from across the bay, tall and silver-haired, wearing the insignia of a fleet admiral. Elena recognized her immediately from old news broadcasts, though the woman before her looked older, harder, carved by 2 decades of struggle that the historical records could never fully capture. "Admiral Cole," Elena said, straightening automatically. "Captain Reyes," Cole replied, her sharp eyes taking in Elena's uniform and insignia. "Ambassador Osei told us you were coming. I understand you're looking for someone." Elena's throat tightened. "Commander Daniel Reyes. He was your chief engineer, 20 years ago." "I'm his daughter." Something shifted in Cole's expression, a flicker of warmth breaking through the weathered composure. "He talked about you often. Every year, on what he believed was your birthday, the whole engineering deck would mark the occasion. He never stopped believing he'd see you again." She gestured toward a nearby corridor. "He's in the engineering section. I'll take you there myself." The walk through the USS Earth felt like stepping into a different world entirely. The corridors were a strange mixture of original Terran design, and newer sections built from dark metal, their surfaces marked with faint patterns that seemed to shift slightly, depending on the angle Elena viewed them from. Crew members they passed nodded respectfully to Admiral Cole, their eyes lingering curiously on Elena, clearly aware of who she must be. "Your father led the team that developed our hull plating technology," Cole explained as they walked. "Without his work, we wouldn't have survived our 5th year in the Expanse, let alone 20. He's a hero here, Captain. I hope you understand that." "I want to understand everything," Elena said. "What happened out there? What did you find?" Cole's expression grew distant for a moment. "A graveyard, at first. The remains of a civilization far older and more advanced than anything the Concord has ever encountered. And something else, living in the dark spaces of that graveyard, that had put them there." She shook her head slightly. "It's a long story, Captain. One I imagine your father will want to be the one to tell you himself." They reached a set of heavy doors marked with engineering department insignia. Cole paused before opening them. "He doesn't know you're here. I thought it best to surprise him. I hope that was the right choice." Elena's heart pounded in her chest. It was. The doors slid open, revealing a large workshop filled with strange equipment, half-disassembled machinery, and the low hum of active systems. In the center of it all stood a man Elena recognized instantly from photographs, though 20 years had changed him considerably. His hair had gone completely gray, his face lined with the marks of hardship and age, but his eyes, when he turned and saw her standing in the doorway, were exactly as she remembered from every photo her mother had ever shown her. "Elena?" Daniel Reyes said, his voice barely above a whisper. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Then Elena crossed the room quickly, and her father pulled her into an embrace that felt like it carried the weight of 20 missed years within it. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing that needed to be said in that moment, only the simple, overwhelming relief of finding each other after so long. Admiral Cole quietly excused herself from the room, leaving father and daughter alone, with 2 decades of catching up to do. They sat together for hours in his cramped quarters, surrounded by tools, half-finished schematics, and the small personal effects he had accumulated over 20 years of exile. Elena told him about growing up on Haven, about her mother's unwavering hope, about the Dominion soldiers who had walked through their town when she was 12 years old. Daniel listened to every word with an intensity that made clear how much he had missed, how many small, ordinary moments of his daughter's life had passed without him. "I have something for you," he said eventually, reaching into a drawer built into his workbench. He withdrew a small, worn data chip. "I recorded messages. Every year, on the day I believed was your birthday, even before we had any real hope of getting home. I didn't know if you'd ever hear them, but I wanted them to exist anyway, in case we found a way back." Elena took the chip with trembling hands, 20 small recordings representing 20 years of a father speaking to a daughter he had never met, hoping against growing odds that his words might someday reach her. "Your mother," Daniel said carefully, his voice catching slightly. "Is she?" "She's alive," Elena said quickly, seeing the fear in his eyes. "She's on Haven. She never remarried. She kept your jacket on a shelf for 20 years. She watched relief and grief mingle on her father's face in equal measure. She doesn't know I'm here yet. I wanted to see you first, before I told her, in case I wasn't the same person she remembered," Daniel finished quietly. He was silent for a moment, considering his own words carefully. "I'm not, Elena. Not entirely. 20 years in that place changed all of us. I've seen things, done things, that the man who left home never could have imagined. I don't know how to explain that to her. I don't know if she'll understand." "She's waited 20 years, Dad," Elena said gently. "I think she'll understand more than you expect." Daniel reached out and took her hand, his engineer's calluses rough against her skin. "I want to see her. As soon as this ship can arrange it. I've missed so much already. I don't want to miss any more." Word of the USS Earth's return spread rapidly across the galaxy in the hours and days that followed. Every major news network, human and alien alike, carried footage of the massive fleet's arrival, analysts and commentators speculating wildly about what it meant for the balance of power that had settled over the galaxy in humanity's long absence. At Concord Central, Ambassador Osei found himself suddenly the center of intense diplomatic attention, every delegation seeking private meetings, trying to gauge what the return of humanity's flagship truly meant. Admiral Cole, for her part, made it clear through official channels that the USS Earth had returned peacefully, seeking only to reunite with the Terran Assembly and assess the state of human territories after 2 decades of absence. But peaceful intentions did not calm every fear. The Karn Dominion, which had spent years slowly annexing human colonies along the border, grew increasingly aggressive in its public statements. Commander Threx, now speaking with the full backing of the Dominion's military council, declared publicly that any attempt by the so-called Terran fleet to reclaim territories currently under Dominion protection would be considered an act of war. Admiral Cole's response, delivered through a formal statement to the Concord Council, was measured but unmistakably firm. The United Terran Assembly, she stated, recognized no legitimate claim by any outside power over Terran colonies, regardless of how long those colonies had existed under so-called protection agreements. The USS Earth and its fleet would begin a tour of Terran space, she announced, to assess conditions and, where necessary, assist in restoring proper Terran governance. It was, everyone understood, a polite way of announcing that humanity intended to take back what had been lost. At Haven Colony, Elena's mother received the news of her husband's survival through a personal call from Elena herself, patched through the USS Earth's long-range communication array. Julia Reyes sat silently for nearly a full minute after Elena finished speaking, tears streaming down her face, before she finally managed to ask the only question that mattered to her in that moment. Is he coming home? As soon as the fleet's tour allows it, Elena promised. He wants to see you, Mom. He talks about you constantly. Arrangements were made within days for Daniel to take a brief leave from his engineering duties, traveling aboard a fast courier ship to Haven for a reunion that would later be quietly filmed by a local news crew and broadcast, much to Daniel's own embarrassment, across half of Terran space. Elena was not present for that reunion, called instead to Concord Central for the diplomatic work that would soon consume most of her waking hours, but her father described it to her afterward, in a message so full of quiet joy that she found herself crying happy tears, reading it in her quarters aboard the USS Earth. In the days that followed, the diplomatic situation at Concord Central grew increasingly complex. Delegations from a dozen worlds requested formal meetings with Admiral Cole, each seeking to understand what the fleet's return meant for their own interests in the region. Some, like the Kethrani Assembly, offered cautious congratulations and expressed hope for renewed trade relationships that had flourished before humanity's long absence. Others, like the Vey Combine, sent representatives whose polite words barely concealed their anxiety over trade routes and contracts that suddenly seemed far less secure than they had only weeks before. Elena spent the following days aboard the USS Earth, reconnecting with her father and learning, piece by piece, the incredible story of the fleet's 20 years in the hollow expanse. She met Dr. Amara Singh, now the fleet's chief science officer, who explained in careful detail the strange properties of dark metal and the technology recovered from the ancient architect ruins. She toured the ship's massive memorial hall, reading the names of hundreds of crew members lost during the long exile, a sobering reminder of the price paid for the fleet's survival and the knowledge they now carried. She also began to understand, slowly, the changes that 20 years had wrought on the fleet's culture and priorities. This was not the same USS Earth that had left 20 years ago, filled with young officers eager to explore the unknown. This was a fleet of hardened survivors, people who had watched friends and family die to creatures beyond ordinary understanding, who had built an entire new form of technology out of desperate necessity. They were proud of what they had accomplished, but they carried the weight of everything it had cost them. "We're not the same people who left," her father told her one evening, as they sat together in his private quarters aboard the ship. "I know Admiral Cole worries about how the galaxy will see us now. We've changed. We had to. But I think, in some ways, we've become exactly what humanity needs right now." "What do you mean?" Elena asked. Her father considered the question carefully before answering. "The galaxy stopped fearing us because we stopped being strong enough to be feared. Every colony taken, every trade route lost, it happened because we couldn't back up our claims with real strength anymore. That's changed now. We have technology no other species in this galaxy possesses. We have a fleet capable of standing against threats that make the Karn Dominion look like children playing at war." He paused, his expression growing serious. But strength alone isn't enough, Elena. We have to be careful about how we use it. It would be easy to become the very thing we fought so hard to survive against out there. Elena thought about Threx's threats, about the colonies still under Dominion control, about the years of watching her people lose ground, while the galaxy's other powers looked on with quiet satisfaction. Elena thought of the years she had spent as a cadet, studying old battle records of the Terran Dominion War, trying to understand how a species that had once fought the Dominion to a standstill had fallen so far in just 2 decades. She thought of every colony she had watched slip further under foreign influence during her years of service, every diplomatic defeat Ambassador Ose had reported with growing weariness in his voice. Corvus Colony, she said suddenly. The Dominion moved a fleet in just before you arrived. 200,000 people, no real defenses. Her father's expression hardened. Admiral Cole knows about Corvus. It's the first stop on our tour of Terran space. He met her eyes, and for a moment, Elena saw a flash of the young engineer he must have been 20 years ago, before the expanse had aged him, determined and resolute. The Dominion has had 20 years to grow comfortable, believing humanity would never be strong enough to challenge them again. I think they're about to learn how wrong they were. 3 days later, the USS Earth and a significant portion of its darkship fleet departed Concord Central, setting course for the Corvus system. Elena, granted special permission by Admiral Cole to remain aboard as an observer, stood on the bridge alongside her father and watched as the fleet made its final approach. Sensor readings showed the Karn Dominion fleet already in position around Corvus, a force of nearly 50 warships blockading the colony's orbital paths, preventing any supplies or reinforcements from reaching the surface. Commander Threx's flagship sat at the center of the formation, clearly expecting to intimidate whatever response the weakened Terran assembly might muster. What Threx got instead was 200 dark ships emerging from Cloak simultaneously, surrounding his entire fleet in a formation so precise and overwhelming that Dominion sensor operators reportedly needed several minutes just to process what had happened. Admiral Cole's voice rang out across an open channel, calm and utterly without doubt. Commander Threx, this is Fleet Admiral Sarah Cole of the United Terran Assembly Navy. You are currently blockading a sovereign Terran colony in direct violation of Concord Treaty law. You will withdraw your fleet from this system within 1 hour, or we will withdraw it for you. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Elena began to wonder if Threx would respond at all. When his voice finally came through the channel, it carried a note of barely controlled fury, mixed with something that sounded distinctly like fear. You would start a war over one insignificant farming colony, Admiral? I would end an occupation that should never have begun, Cole replied evenly. The choice of whether it becomes a war is entirely yours, Commander. I suggest you choose wisely. Elena watched the tactical display, her heart pounding as the minutes ticked by, wondering whether Threx would truly be foolish enough to test the fleet that had just spent 20 years surviving horrors the Dominion could scarcely imagine. Beside her, Fleet Captain Torres monitored the Dominion fleet's every movement with practiced calm, occasionally murmuring updates to Admiral Cole. Their formation hasn't shifted toward an attack posture, Admiral. Looks like Threx is still weighing his options. He should be, Cole replied without looking away from the display. A wise commander doesn't gamble his entire fleet on pride alone. We'll find out shortly whether Commander Threx qualifies as wise. Elena's father, standing nearby at an auxiliary engineering console, caught her eye briefly and offered a small, reassuring nod. 20 years of facing down horrors in the hollow expanse had clearly taught him a kind of steadiness that Elena, despite her academy training, still found herself struggling to match. She forced herself to breathe evenly, to trust in the Admiral's judgment and the fleet's demonstrated capabilities, even as the tension in the command center remained thick enough to cut with a blade. The minutes continued to tick down. At the 20-minute mark, Dominion sensor readings showed a handful of ships beginning to power down their weapons systems, a small but significant sign that the standoff might yet resolve without bloodshed. By the time Admiral Cole's deadline finally arrived, the entire Dominion blockade had begun a slow, grudging withdrawal from Corvus space, Commander Threx's flagship the last to disengage, lingering just long enough to make clear that the retreat was a choice made under protest, rather than genuine acceptance of defeat. The hour Admiral Cole gave Commander Threx passed in tense silence aboard the USS Earth's bridge. Elena stood beside her father near the engineering station, watching the tactical display where 200 dark ships hung in perfect formation around the Dominion fleet, weapons ready but not yet active. Every few minutes, sensor officers called out updates on Dominion fleet movements, small shifts in formation that suggested Threx was preparing for something, though no one could be certain what. "He's stalling," said Captain Reyes's father quietly. "Waiting for reinforcements, probably." Admiral Cole, standing at the command podium, seemed unbothered by the possibility. "Let him wait for whatever he thinks is coming. It won't change the outcome." With 11 minutes remaining on the ultimatum, Dominion sensor readings picked up a second fleet entering the system, nearly 30 additional warships arriving from the direction of Dominion space. Threx's voice returned to the open channel almost immediately, his confidence noticeably restored. "It seems the numbers have shifted somewhat, Admiral," he said. "Perhaps it is you who should reconsider." Admiral Cole studied the new arrivals on her tactical display for a long moment before responding. "Numbers were never the deciding factor here, Commander. But since you seem to require a demonstration, I'll provide one." She turned to her tactical officer. "Target the lead reinforcement vessel. Disable only. No lethal force. Let's remind the commander what 20 years in the hollow expanse taught us about precision." A single dark ship broke formation, moving with a speed that seemed to defy its massive size, closing the distance to the newly arrived Dominion flagship in seconds. Before Dominion defenses could even register the threat, a focused beam of dark energy lanced out, striking the ship's engine section with surgical precision. The vessel's drive systems went dark instantly, leaving it drifting powerless among its escort ships, completely disabled without a single life lost. The silence on the comm channel that followed was deafening. "That," Admiral Cole said, "is what precision looks like, Commander. I trust you understand now that this is not a fight the Dominion can win, should you choose to force the issue. You have 9 minutes remaining." Elena watched the tactical display, her breath caught in her throat, as the Dominion fleet's formation shifted uneasily. She could only imagine the frantic conversations happening aboard Threx's flagship in that moment, the realization dawning that whatever technology humanity had developed during their long absence, it was far beyond anything the Dominion possessed. With 3 minutes remaining, Threx's voice returned, stripped of its earlier arrogance. "The Dominion will withdraw from the Corvus system, Admiral. But know this. The Dominion Council will not simply accept this humiliation. There will be consequences." "I'm sure there will be discussions," Admiral Cole replied. "I look forward to having them through proper diplomatic channels at Concord Central, rather than through blockades of sovereign Terran territory." She paused. "Withdraw your fleet, Commander. Today, that will be enough." Slowly, reluctantly, the Dominion fleet began to disengage, their formation breaking apart, as ships turned away from Corvus and set course back toward Dominion space. Cheers erupted across the USS Earth's bridge, as the last Dominion vessel finally crossed beyond weapons range, the colony below finally free from the blockade that had trapped it for weeks. Below on Corvus Colony, word of the Dominion withdrawal spread within minutes, colonists pouring out into the streets to celebrate the end of a blockade that had left them cut off from vital supplies for nearly 3 weeks. Colony Governor Mireille Duval, who had spent those weeks negotiating desperately and fruitlessly with Dominion representatives for basic humanitarian access, recorded a message of gratitude to Admiral Cole that would later be replayed across every human news network, tears visible in her eyes as she thanked the fleet for a rescue she had genuinely feared might never come. Elena felt tears prick at her eyes, watching the celebration around her. It was the first real victory humanity had achieved in years, the first sign that the long, slow decline might finally be reversing. But Admiral Cole did not join in the celebration. She remained at the command podium, her expression thoughtful and cautious. Elena's father noticed the same thing and moved closer to the Admiral. "You don't think this is over," he said quietly. "Threx said it himself," Cole replied. "The Dominion Council won't simply accept this. We've embarrassed them publicly, in front of the entire Concord. Powerful people don't forgive that kind of humiliation easily." She looked out at the tactical display, now showing the peaceful, empty space around Corvus Colony. This was one system, Commander. There are dozens more like it across Terran space. Colonies and territories claimed by a dozen different powers during our absence. We can't be everywhere at once, and every victory we win publicly makes our enemies more determined to strike back harder. Elena returned to Concord Central 2 days after the confrontation at Corvus, carrying with her a full report for Ambassador Osei on the engagement and its immediate aftermath. She found him in his office, surrounded by data pads and half-finished briefing documents, looking more hopeful than she had seen him in months. The reaction across the Concord has been mixed, as expected, Osei told her, gesturing for her to sit. Several delegations have privately congratulated us. Others are clearly frightened by what they saw. Fear can cut both ways in politics, Elena. It can drive people toward respect, or it can drive them toward desperate, aggressive alliances against whatever they perceive as the greater threat. You think the Dominion will try to build a coalition against us, Elena said. I think it's the most logical response to a threat they can no longer face alone, Osei replied. Watch for it. If the Dominion starts reaching out to other powers who benefited from our absence, that's when things could truly become dangerous. Osei's prediction proved prescient far sooner than either of them expected. Admiral Cole's caution proved well-founded. Over the following weeks, as the USS Earth's fleet continued its tour of Terran space, liberating colony after colony from various forms of occupation and unfair protection agreements, resistance began to organize. The Karn Dominion, humiliated at Corvus, began quietly building alliances with other powers who had also profited from humanity's long absence, forming what they called the Sovereign Compact, a coalition determined to resist what they saw as an unacceptable resurgence of Terran military power. Elena, now serving as a liaison between Admiral Cole's command staff and Ambassador Osei's diplomatic efforts at Concord Central, watched the tensions escalate with growing concern. Every liberated colony was a victory for humanity, but each one also added fuel to the fire of resentment, building among the powers who had grown comfortable during the Terran Assembly's weakness. Elena had spent those weeks traveling between Concord Central and the various liberated colonies, helping coordinate the difficult work of restoring Terran governance after years of foreign administration. It was not always simple. Some colonies had grown genuinely dependent on infrastructure and trade relationships built during the years of Dominion or Combine control, and disentangling those relationships fairly, without causing genuine hardship to ordinary colonists, required patience and care that Admiral Cole insisted upon at every step. Elena came to respect the Admiral more with each passing week, watching her balance the fleet's overwhelming military advantage against a genuine commitment to doing right by the people she was liberating. They're calling us aggressors, Osei told her during one tense meeting at Concord Central. The Sovereign Compact is petitioning the full Concord Council to declare the USS Earth's fleet a destabilizing threat. If they succeed, we could face sanctions, or worse. We're liberating our own colonies, Elena protested. How is that aggression? Perception matters as much as truth in politics, Elena, Osei said wearily. A galaxy that grew comfortable with a weak humanity is frightened by a strong one, regardless of how justified our actions are. The crisis came to a head 6 weeks after the confrontation at Corvus, when the Sovereign Compact, backed by the combined military strength of the Karn Dominion and 3 other allied powers, moved a massive combined fleet into the Meridian system, directly threatening both the station Elena had called home for years and several nearby human colonies that Admiral Cole's fleet had recently liberated. Elena was aboard the USS Earth when the news arrived, her father working nearby in the engineering section as sensor reports confirmed the scale of the threat. Nearly 300 warships, drawn from 4 different species, had gathered at Meridian, clearly intending to make a statement that could not be ignored. Admiral Cole called an emergency meeting of her senior staff, Elena included given her unique position as both a Terran officer and Osei's diplomatic liaison. The tension in the room was palpable, as tactical officers laid out the scale of the threat facing them. 300 warships, said Fleet Captain Miguel Torres, Cole's second-in-command. Combined firepower exceeding anything the Dominion alone could field. This isn't a warning anymore, Admiral. This is an attempt to break us before we can grow any stronger. What's our current fleet strength in the region? Cole asked. 180 dark ships, plus the USS Earth itself, Torres reported. We're outnumbered, though given our technological advantages, the true balance of power is harder to calculate. Dr. Amara Singh, seated near the back of the room, spoke up. Admiral, I'd like to point out that we've never tested our fleet against a combined force of this size. The Hollow taught us to fight as a smaller, more mobile force against overwhelming odds. This is a different kind of challenge entirely. With respect, Doctor, Torres countered. These are conventional warships crewed by conventional beings, not creatures from beyond known physics. Whatever advantage the Hollow held over us in raw unpredictability, the compact fleet lacks entirely. I'd wager our tactical officers can predict their formations and responses far more reliably than we ever could the Hollows. That may be true, Singh admitted, but it also means the compact commanders can predict us in turn, at least to some degree, based on standard Terran military doctrine. We should assume they've studied everything available about our pre-exile tactics. Admiral Cole considered both points carefully. Then we won't rely on pre-exile tactics. We'll rely on what 20 years in the Expanse actually taught us: speed, precision, and patience. We are not going to win this through brute force alone, even though we likely could. We're going to win it, if it comes to that, by demonstrating exactly how little brute force actually matters against a fleet as capable as ours. Admiral Cole considered this carefully before responding. Then perhaps it's time we applied everything the Hollow taught us to a new kind of enemy. She turned to the tactical display, studying the disposition of the Sovereign compact fleet gathering at Meridian. Captain Torres, I want a full analysis of their formation, weak points, communication patterns. Dr. Singh, I want our cloaking systems at maximum efficiency. If they want to test our strength, we'll make sure they understand exactly what they're testing themselves against. Elena raised her hand slightly, drawing the room's attention. Admiral, if I may, before this becomes a battle, shouldn't we exhaust every diplomatic option? Ambassador Osei has been working to bring this before the full Concord Council. A war here, even a victory, could cost us any goodwill we've built with neutral powers. Cole studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You're right, Captain Reyes. War should always be the last option, not the first. She turned to her communications officer. Open a channel to the Sovereign Compact Fleet Commander. Let's see if reason can accomplish what a show of force alone cannot. The channel opened, and the image of a stern, four-eyed alien commander appeared on the main display, flanked by representatives from the other compact powers, including Commander Threx, whose expression carried barely concealed satisfaction at finally having the numbers to challenge the USS Earth directly. Admiral Cole, the lead commander said, his translated voice carrying an edge of formality that did little to hide the underlying threat. I am Fleet Marshal Korath of the Sovereign Compact. You stand accused of destabilizing established territorial agreements across dozens of systems. The Compact demands you withdraw your forces immediately and cease all further liberation actions, or face the consequences of continued aggression. With respect, Fleet Marshal, Cole replied evenly. Those territorial agreements were established through the exploitation of a temporarily weakened Terran assembly during our fleet's absence. We are not committing aggression, we are correcting an injustice. An injustice measured by whom? Korath countered. The Compact has invested significant resources into developing these territories over the past 2 decades. You cannot simply return after 20 years and expect the galaxy to reset itself to your convenience. Elena watched the exchange with growing tension, understanding that this conversation, more than any battle, would determine the future course of humanity's place in the galaxy. She glanced at her father, who watched the screen with an unreadable expression, clearly remembering all too well the cost of the battles that had shaped the fleet he now served. Fleet Marshal Korath, Admiral Cole said finally, her voice carrying a weight that silenced the murmuring on both sides of the channel. My fleet spent 20 years fighting for survival, against threats this galaxy cannot begin to imagine. We did not do so to return home, and watch our people remain subjugated by powers who took advantage of our absence. I am offering you a choice, made in good faith. Withdraw peacefully, and we will pursue a fair resolution through the Concord Council, addressing legitimate concerns about transition and compensation where appropriate. Refuse, and you will learn exactly what this fleet survived to bring home with it. Elena found herself gripping the edge of the console in front of her, aware of just how much weight rested on the next few moments. She thought of Corvus Colony, of Governor Duval's tearful gratitude, of the growing number of human worlds that had welcomed the return of Terran governance, with genuine relief and hope. She thought, too, of the cost such hope might carry if the standoff at Meridian tipped toward violence instead of resolution, of the lives on both sides that would be lost in a battle that diplomacy might yet prevent. Beside her, Fleet Captain Torres kept his tactical readouts active, ready to relay firing solutions the instant Admiral Cole gave the order, though his expression suggested he hoped fervently that such an order would never come. Dr. Singh watched the exchange with the careful attention of a scientist, observing a delicate experiment whose outcome could not be predicted with certainty, no matter how much data had been gathered beforehand. Admiral Cole herself stood perfectly still at the command podium, her weathered face giving away nothing of the tension Elena knew she must be feeling. 20 years of commanding a fleet through impossible odds had taught her, if nothing else, the value of patience in moments when patience was hardest to maintain. Fleet Marshal Korath did not answer immediately. His 4 eyes shifted between the other compact representatives visible on the shared channel, silent conversations passing between them that the Terran side of the connection could not hear. Elena held her breath, watching the tactical display where 300 sovereign compact warships hung in formation, opposite the smaller but far more advanced Terran fleet. Commander Threx broke the silence first, his voice carrying an edge of impatience. "This is a waste of time, Marshal. The Terrans grow bold because we have allowed them to believe their new toys make them untouchable. I say we test that belief." "Careful, Commander," Cole said, her tone still measured despite the provocation. "You already tested that belief once, at Corvus. I recall the outcome did not favor your confidence." Threx's expression darkened, but before he could respond, Fleet Marshal Korath raised a hand, silencing him. "Enough, Commander. This is not merely about pride." He turned his attention back to the main channel, addressing Cole directly. "Admiral, before this escalates further, I would ask a simple question. Your fleet's technology, this dark metal your ships are built from, this precision, your weapons demonstrated at Corvus, where did such advancement come from in only 20 years? Elena understood immediately what Korath was truly asking. He wanted to know whether this was a temporary advantage, a stroke of luck that might fade, or something far more permanent and threatening to the established order of galactic power. Admiral Cole considered her answer carefully. "We found the remains of a civilization far older and more advanced than any currently known to the Concord, Fleet Marshal. A species called the Architects, destroyed long before recorded history, by threats this galaxy has never encountered. We did not steal power we do not understand. We earned it, through 20 years of survival against horrors that make your compact's warships look like training vessels." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "I tell you this, not as a threat, but as context. My fleet did not return home seeking conquest or revenge. We returned seeking to restore what was unfairly taken from us during our absence, and to warn the galaxy that there are dangers out there, far greater than any rivalry between our peoples." Dr. Amara Singh, watching from her station, added quietly for the benefit of the Terran command staff alone, "It's not entirely a bluff, Admiral." Sensor readings from the gate core activation showed residual energy signatures consistent with hollow activity bleeding through, faintly, before it stabilized. If that region remains active, it's possible something could eventually follow the path we cut through to get home. Cole nodded slightly, filing the information away, though she did not share it further on the open channel. Some warnings were better delivered through diplomatic channels once trust had been rebuilt, not used as leverage in a moment of crisis. Fleet Marshal Korath studied Admiral Cole for a long moment, clearly weighing the implications of everything he had just heard. Finally, he spoke again, his tone shifting subtly toward something more cautious and considered. "The Compact did not gather this fleet lightly, Admiral. We did so because your fleet's rapid liberation of contested territories left us little time to consider alternatives before decisions were made for us by more aggressive factions within our own alliance." He glanced briefly toward Threx before continuing. "Perhaps there is room here for a different approach than the one we arrived prepared for." "I would welcome that, Fleet Marshal," Cole replied. "The Terran Assembly has no interest in permanent hostility with the Compact powers. We seek only the return of what rightfully belongs to us, and a fair, negotiated resolution for territories where genuine investment and development occurred during our absence. That is a conversation best held at Concord Central, through proper channels, not across battle lines." Korath was silent for several long seconds before finally nodding. "I will bring this proposal before the full Compact Council. In the meantime, I am ordering our fleet to withdraw to a neutral distance, pending further negotiation." He glanced pointedly at Threx. I trust the Dominion will respect this decision, Commander, regardless of your personal feelings on the matter. Threx's jaw tightened visibly, but he offered a stiff nod of acknowledgement, clearly unwilling to defy the Compact's collective decision, even if he disagreed with it personally. As the channel closed and the Sovereign Compact fleet began its slow withdrawal from the Meridian system, a wave of relief swept through the USS Earth's bridge. Elena felt tears prick at her eyes again, this time from relief rather than fear. War had been avoided, at least for now, and a path toward genuine negotiation had opened where conflict had seemed nearly inevitable only minutes before. Admiral Cole allowed herself a small, tired smile as she turned to her staff. Well done, everyone. Captain Torres, maintain defensive positions until the Compact fleet has fully withdrawn. Dr. Singh, I want continued monitoring of any residual hollow activity near the Gate Core site. That's a conversation we'll need to have with the full Concord Council eventually, but carefully, and on our terms. She turned finally to Elena, and Captain Reyes. I believe Ambassador Osei will want a full report on today's proceedings. I trust you're up for the task. Yes, Admiral, Elena replied, unable to keep a small smile of her own from breaking through. In the days immediately following the standoff at Meridian, Elena barely had time to process how close the galaxy had come to a war that might have cost countless lives on both sides. She threw herself into the diplomatic work that followed, serving as Ambassador Osei's closest aide during the long, difficult process of turning a fragile ceasefire into something more permanent. It was exhausting, often frustrating work, filled with long hours reviewing territorial claims, compensation frameworks, and transition timelines that satisfied no one completely, but that both sides could, eventually, accept as fair. Her father visited Concord Central during a break in his research work, and the two of them shared a quiet dinner in one of the station's small human-run restaurants, a rare moment of normalcy amid months of high-stakes negotiation. You look tired, Daniel observed, studying his daughter's face across the table. I am tired, Elena admitted. I used to think winning would be the hard part. Turns out keeping the peace afterward might be harder. Her father smiled slightly, a tired but genuine expression. Welcome to command, in whatever form it takes. Admiral Cole told me something once, during our worst year in the Expanse, when I asked her how she kept making impossible decisions, day after day, without breaking under the weight of them. She said the trick wasn't avoiding the weight, it was making sure you never carried it alone. He reached across the table and squeezed Elena's hand. You're not carrying this alone, Elena. Osei, Cole, me, your mother. We're all in this with you. The negotiations that followed at Concord Central stretched on for nearly 2 months, complicated and difficult, but ultimately productive. The Sovereign Compact, faced with the reality of a Terran assembly backed by genuinely superior military technology, proved far more willing to negotiate fair terms than anyone had initially expected. Colonies with genuine long-term compact investment were allowed transitional agreements, giving both sides reasonable compensation and time to adjust. Colonies that had been outright annexed or exploited, like Corvus, were returned to full Terran governance without dispute. Commander Threx, humiliated once again by the outcome of negotiations he had hoped to avoid entirely, found himself quietly relieved of his command by the Dominion Council shortly after the agreements were finalized, his aggressive posturing having cost the Dominion significant standing among its compact allies. Fleet Marshal Korath, by contrast, emerged from the crisis with his reputation strengthened, credited by several compact member worlds with having avoided a catastrophic war through careful, level-headed judgment at the critical moment. He and Admiral Cole would go on to maintain a cautious but genuine working relationship in the years that followed, each recognizing in the other a leader who valued stability over pride. Not every negotiation went smoothly. Several smaller powers within the old Sovereign Compact resisted the new agreements bitterly, and Elena spent countless hours in tense meetings, trying to find compromises that would hold. One particularly difficult negotiation involved a mining consortium that had spent 15 years developing extraction operations on a planet in the Kessler system, a world that had been human territory before the USS Earth's disappearance. Elena worked for nearly 3 weeks with Osei and consortium representatives to craft an agreement that returned the planet to Terran governance, while allowing the consortium a fair transitional period to relocate its operations. A solution that satisfied no one entirely, but that both sides ultimately accepted, rather than risk further conflict. It was during these long months of careful, unglamorous diplomatic work that Elena began to understand something her father and Admiral Cole had both tried to tell her in different ways. The battle at Corvus and the standoff at Meridian had captured the galaxy's attention, dramatic moments that made for compelling news broadcasts. But the real work of rebuilding humanity's place among the stars happened in rooms like these, in patient negotiation and careful compromise, far from any battlefield. Ambassador Osei, exhausted but visibly proud after months of difficult diplomatic work, stood beside Elena and Admiral Cole during the final signing ceremony at Concord Central, watching as representatives from a dozen different powers formally acknowledged the restored sovereignty of Terran space. 20 years of decline, reversed in less than 3 months, Osei said quietly to Elena as the ceremony concluded. I never thought I'd see this day. Neither did I, Elena admitted. Not really. I think part of me had given up hope a long time ago. And now? Osei asked. Elena looked across the room toward where her father stood alongside Admiral Cole and Dr. Singh, discussing something animatedly with a group of Concord scientists, eager to learn more about the extraordinary technology the USS Earth's crew had developed during their long exile. Now I think we're just getting started, she said. 6 months later, Elena stood once again on the observation deck of Meridian Station, though the view outside had changed considerably. The station itself had been reinforced with Terran defensive technology shared under the new agreements, and beyond it, several dark ships patrolled peacefully, a visible reminder of humanity's restored strength, no longer feared for its potential to cause harm, but respected as a genuine deterrent against those who might consider testing Terran resolve again. Her father had chosen to remain aboard the USS Earth, continuing his engineering work alongside Dr. Singh, now leading a joint Terran Concord research initiative studying the remaining secrets of architect technology, always mindful of Cole's warning about the hollow that might still linger in the depths of the expanse. Admiral Cole herself had been appointed to a new position, overseeing the integration of the fleet's advanced technology into the broader Terran Assembly's defense infrastructure, a slow and careful process meant to ensure humanity's newfound strength served as a foundation for lasting peace, rather than a temptation toward unchecked power. Elena had been promoted, given command of a small dark ship squadron, tasked with patrolling the border regions where tensions still occasionally flared, though nothing approaching the crisis that had nearly erupted at Meridian months earlier. It was demanding work, but meaningful, a chance to help build the kind of galaxy she had once feared humanity might never see again. Her squadron included several young officers who, like her, had grown up during the years of Terran decline, eager for the chance to serve a version of the assembly that no longer had to bow to outside pressure. She also worked alongside a handful of veterans from the original USS Earth crew, men and women who carried the hard-earned wisdom of 20 years in the hollow expanse, and who took quiet pride in mentoring a new generation that had not lived through that particular crucible themselves. Elena found herself grateful for their steadiness, especially during the tense early patrols along contested border regions, where old resentments occasionally flared into minor incidents that required careful, patient handling to prevent from escalating. Haven Colony, her childhood home, had changed considerably in the months since the USS Earth's return. Dominion soldiers were gone entirely now, replaced by a modest Terran garrison that colony leaders had specifically requested, eager to ensure the mistakes of the past 2 decades were not repeated. Elena visited when her patrol schedule allowed, always finding her mother a little more at ease each time. The shelf that had once held only photographs and a worn flight jacket, now also holding new pictures, taken during Daniel's visits home, of a family slowly learning how to be whole again after 20 years apart. She thought often of her father's words, spoken that first evening they had spent together after 20 years apart. Strength alone isn't enough. We have to be careful about how we use it. It was a lesson the entire Terran Assembly had taken to heart in the months since the USS Earth's return, choosing negotiation over conquest, restoration over revenge. Even when the temptation to simply seize back everything lost during their long absence must have been powerful for those who had suffered most during the years of decline. As Elena watched the peaceful activity outside Meridian Station's viewport, Her communicator chimed softly. A message from her father, sent from aboard the USS Earth, still stationed at the edge of the hollow expanse, monitoring the gate core site for any sign of the strange energy readings that continued to occasionally flicker at the edge of Dr. Singh's sensors. Thinking of you today, the message read simply. 20 years was a long time to be apart. I'm grateful every single day that it wasn't longer. Whatever comes next, whatever else might be waiting out there in the dark, I know we'll face it together this time. Love, Dad. Elena smiled, tucking the communicator away as she turned back toward the busy activity of the station behind her. The galaxy remained a complicated, sometimes dangerous place, filled with old rivalries and new uncertainties. Somewhere out past the edge of known space, in the depths of the hollow expanse, something ancient and hungry might still be stirring, a threat that could one day demand humanity's newfound strength be tested again. But for now, humanity had come home. Not as the weakened, fading power it had been in the years before the USS Earth's return, and not as a conqueror seeking to punish those who had taken advantage of its absence, but as something stronger and wiser than before, tempered by 20 years of hardship, into a people who understood both the necessity of strength and the importance of using it well. The USS Earth had disappeared for 20 years. It had returned with a fleet of dark ships capable of reshaping the balance of galactic power. But more importantly, it had returned with the hard-won wisdom of everyone who had survived those 20 years in the dark, a wisdom that would guide humanity's place among the stars for generations to come. Elena Reyes turned away from the viewport and walked back into the busy heart of Meridian Station, ready to face whatever the future held, no longer haunted by the fears of decline that had shaped her childhood, but inspired instead by the promise of everything her people had proven themselves capable of achieving, together, against even the darkest odds the universe could offer. The stars ahead were no longer something to fear. They were, once again, humanity's to explore.